Here are the main two ways that I often bring in masking fluid into my watercolor painting process in order to not only simplify the process but also arrive at better results. And also, I want to share the main things that I have in mind in order to avoid undesired accidents when using this invaluable tool. Let's jump in. So the first way that I like using masking fluid when painting with watercolor is to help me block out and protect those brightest highlight shapes. And this is even more helpful whenever I am painting something where those highlight shapes are very small or very complex, such as when I am painting mechanic objects or metal objects or maybe even water, or in this case I want these strawberries to look moist, and the masking fluid really helps me keep those little teeny tiny highlight shapes around the seeds protected as I am painting the strawberry so that I can really create that seed texture throughout the strawberries. When we're painting with watercolor, it's the bright paper that is going to stand in place for our highlights, and that bright paper helps us create those lighter value or tone areas which are so important if we're wanting to develop any level of realism in our work. Plus, by bringing in that paper as part of the piece, we're going to be able to arrive at that light glowing end result that is so particular to watercolor. We're using the translucency of the medium in combination with the white paper to help us develop that wide range of values that we need to create believable depth. And this is why white paint is not even necessary when we're painting with watercolor. And of course, you can create amazing looking paintings that do have high levels of realism with no masking fluid, but you do have to plan and protect those highlight shapes, and it can be often difficult because you have to work around them, and sometimes it can be stressful. It can feel like we're walking on eggshells trying to keep those highlights protected. Whereas when you bring in masking fluid, you can move through the painting process a lot more easily, knowing that those highlights are blocked out for you. In this particular case as well, I use masking fluid to help me protect the white petals in these little flowers. Even though these white petals are not highlights, white petals have a very light local value. And so by blocking those petals out with masking fluid, I am keeping them protected so that at the end, they can end up looking like white petals. Another way that I really like using masking fluid when I'm painting with watercolor is to help me create different textures and effects that add interest to the piece. In this particular painting, I placed some masking fluid with wooden skewers throughout that burlap section, and it really helps me convey the rough texture in this type of material. Whenever I'm going to be painting a still life piece or even a landscape with little grasses and wood textures, that kind of thing, I ask myself how I can use masking fluid and place my masking fluid with different alternative tools. I'll be talking about that in just a bit to help me convey those textures. Now let's talk about the main 8 things that I would recommend having in mind so that you can avoid undesired accidents when using masking fluid. The first tip that I have for you is make sure that you're using the right paper. I would always recommend using paper that is 100% cotton, making sure that it is at least 140 pounds or 300 GSM in thickness or in weight. And honestly, if you're going to be using masking fluid for a piece that you're going to be spending a good amount of time on, I would always recommend doing some tests on that paper that you're thinking of using before actually starting with the final piece, because you don't want to run into any trouble when you remove it. I've also heard of masking fluids that attach or adhere to the paper very strongly, and it rips the paper at the end when you remove it. I've never had issues with this colorless masking fluid from Winsor & Newton. I'll make sure to leave a link to it down below in case you'd like to go and check it out. But always do some tests with the masking fluid and the paper that you're thinking of using. Tip number 2 is make sure that you're working in a well-ventilated area, because masking fluid can smell pretty strongly and it can smell pretty bad. Why? Because it has ammonia. Ammonia is added into the masking fluid so that it can prevent mold growth and the consistency can stay as it is over a long period of time.
Tip number 3 is make sure that you are protecting your paintbrush bristles when you're going to be using your paintbrushes to place your masking fluid. I never use my brushes that I really like for painting for masking fluid placement. I actually have cheaper multimedia brushes in my studio that I use for this kind of tool and technique. And as I was briefly mentioning before, I oftentimes enjoy bringing in alternative tools such as toothpicks, wooden skewers, old toothbrushes, and stiff bristled brushes, that kind of thing, to place my masking fluid or to do splattering or different kinds of experimental techniques. Whenever I am using a brush, I make sure to completely coat those bristles in some kind of soap, whether it's liquid hand soap or dishwashing liquid, or even running my paintbrush over a bar of soap so that I can coat those bristles, and that will help protect them when I dip those bristles into the masking fluid. Once I'm done, I make sure to immediately wash my paintbrush bristles out. In this strawberry still life painting process, I used both brushes and a wooden skewer to place my masking fluid. And this is a piece that I created especially to share with my Patreon community. The full tutorial for this piece, which is in real time, it's fully narrated, and it includes downloadables such as my outline sketch, my reference photo, and my supply list, is available over on my Patreon, along with a library of over 100 sketching and watercolor tutorials that I haven't shared anywhere else. If you'd like to learn more about what I am offering over on my Patreon for only a few dollars a month, go ahead and check out the link in the description box below. Moving on to tip number 4, and this one is if you'd like to soften edges or make those highlight shapes created by the masking fluid smaller, you can always go in and do some gentle scrubbing after the masking fluid has been removed, or you can even paint in those white sections with a very pale translucent color, whatever it is that you're using. Paint that color in and make those highlight shapes a little bit smaller and more subtle. This is often something that I do near the end of the painting process if I feel it'll make things look better. And I also want to mention, I remove my masking fluid when I'm maybe 70-80% of the way through the painting process. I always do stuff after removing the masking fluid. Tip number 5 is you can always add a little bit of water into your masking fluid to change the consistency and make it a little bit more watery. If you're going to be adding water into your masking fluid, I would recommend pouring a little bit of your masking fluid into a small container and then adding just a drop at a time into that separate container. You don't want to add so much water that the masking fluid is not able to do its job and block out things properly because it's been diluted too much, or you're not able to lay it down properly. Tip number 6 is avoid leaving your masking fluid on your watercolor paper for too long. There is no specific amount of time that your masking fluid can be left on your paper for without creating any trouble, but I would recommend not leaving it on your watercolor paper for over a week because it can adhere to your paper more strongly, and then it can be impossible or difficult to remove without ripping your watercolor paper. The next tip is don't shake your bottle. Because what happens when you shake your bottle is you'll create little air bubbles in that fluid, and then it'll be hard to place it evenly in those shapes that you're looking to block out. And my last tip is experiment with your masking fluid. Explore this tool separately so that you can expand your horizons in terms of the different effects that you can create with it, and really get used to placing it on your paper with different tools that you're thinking of bringing into your painting process in a more controlled way. This will help you have more tools in your tool bag whenever you're looking for different effects and textures, and it'll also help you tackle those larger, more complete pieces with greater confidence and ease because you'll already have practiced placing it on your paper effectively. Let me know if you'd be interested in a video from me where I share masking fluid exercises to help you develop greater control over this tool and expand your horizons so that you can then use this tool and these techniques in future pieces. I would love to create that for you, but let me know if you're interested. Making time to practice different essential techniques and also gaining mastery over your tools is so important because you'll be able to develop these skills, this knowledge, this confidence to tackle those complete pieces more successfully. If you haven't checked out my video where I explain about the 2 must-know watercolor techniques to practice, which are wet on wet and wet on dry, I would highly recommend checking out this video.